Hello, my name is Dr. Beth Dillard, and this is Linguistics for Educators. So this is the second of two videos that examines first language acquisition. In this video, we're going to look at some current perspectives. So in the first video, we talked about how early theories were built around ideas of imitation, positive reinforcement, and behaviorism. So now we're going to look at the contributions multiple fields have made to our current understandings of first language acquisition, starting with insights from developmental psychology. So developmental psychology asks questions like, do children learn language in the same way they learn other things, such as how to tie their shoes? Or do children have a special cognitive capacity for language learning? So research in this area has shown that there tend to be some predictable stages that children go through as they're learning to speak. So, and these are approximate. So during year one, children develop the physical capacity to produce sounds. They start babbling. Roughly around month 7 to 8, but fairly consistently, children babbling takes on a consonant vowel syllable structure. So they'll start saying things like ta or d. Around month 12, you're going to start to hear single words. And of these, roughly half are words for objects, Pinker pointed out. So these are things that the children can see and touch and things that are important to them in their world. And then roughly around month 18, you start to hear two-word utterances like dog, run. Now, something that's really interesting that's come out of Pinker's work on this is that children can tell the difference between the following two utterances quite early on, around month 18. Big Bird is washing Cookie Monster, and Cookie Monster is washing Big Bird. So you can hear the difference is who is washing who, and the way you know that is by the order of the subject and the verb, who is doing what. And so the researchers tested this by having children sit in front of two screens, one that showed Big Bird doing the washing, one that showed Cookie Monster doing the washing. They would say the utterance, and then they'd ask the children to point to the video that showed what was happening. And children were remarkably accurate at being able to do this. We also see developmental psychology has shown us that vocabulary growth after month 18 tends to grow at roughly one word per 2 hours, which is just an absolute explosion of language. And so developmental psychologists talk about how this rate supports the theory that there is a capacity for language development that is innate in some way, and or proof that humans do have some sort of special cognitive processing capacity for language. Next, we're going to move to some work done by sociologists, anthropologists, educators that have explored how the social context factors into theories of child language acquisition. So, taking into account the social context, we see that language use is variable depending on the social context. So there's different ways that this manifests, but take this one example from Freeman and Freeman. So the utterance, excuse me. We could say, oh, excuse me, as an apology. We could say, excuse me, to get somebody's attention. We might say, excuse me, to try to get past someone, maybe. Notice how we change it ever so slightly to fulfill these different communicative purposes. So, and this is only one example. So this idea that we can use language in nuanced ways to accomplish different communicative purposes is called communicative competence. What's really amazing about children is that they tend to develop this in seemingly intuitive ways. Another important point related to the social context is this reality that speakers tend to adjust their speech based on who they're talking to. Caregivers especially, it's really noticeable when they do this. Though it's important to note that this practice of speaking motherese it's culturally variable. This is not something that everybody does with their children. So one question that some linguists ask is, what role might this altered caretaker talk play in first language acquisition? Now, these ideas have gone into something called social interaction theory. So in some, social interaction theories is what it sounds like. Children acquire language, as they interact with older children and adults. And this is in contrast to behaviorism, which, as we've seen, is this argument that children respond to the environmental stimuli around them. And so this argues that children actually create the needed environment for development through prompting. So what do I mean by that? Well, take the child that's motioning to the table because they want their water bottle, and they maybe try to approximate the word water or approximate the word bottle. Well, hopefully, eventually, the caretaker is going to realize this, hand them their bottle, and hopefully also provide the word, oh, your water. And so children are able to, in some ways, make adjustments to the environment around them by their interactions with adults that allow them to get the input they need for the language that their brain is ready to learn in that moment. Another thing you can think about with this is that adults tend to actually pick up child language and use it. So for example, some good friends, their child came up with uppy, and now everybody still uses uppy, even though the child could actually say, pick me up. And so in this way, children actually, in their effort to get meaning across, make changes to the adult's environment, linguistic environment as well. So now a few studies that follow from this idea of social interaction. One from sociology, and so this work was done by Wells in England. Followed 32 children, somewhat surreptitiously, by putting recorders in their backpacks, capturing their language and their parents' language. Followed them from roughly month 15 through their elementary years. In some, found that the more that the caregiver was correcting student language, child language, the more that child became inhibited in their language usage, and eventually they saw less academic success. However, the caregivers that really focused on meaning with the child later on in schooling, those students seemed to thrive. Another study comes from anthropology. This anthropologist, Shirley Bryce Heath, wrote a groundbreaking work, Ways with Words, and in it she analyzed how language used by 3 different speech communities, she called them Tracton, Rhodeville, and the townspeople, all in this one area of the Carolinas. How did those communities align or misalign with the language of school? How did that language align or misalign? And then what were the implications for those children? Take this one example from her work. She found that each of the 3 speech communities had different norms for a good story and a good storyteller. But it was the townspeople whose way of telling stories was privileged in the schools. And so as a result, the teachers didn't recognize at how good students were from Tracton and Rhodeville at telling stories because their ways of telling stories didn't align with theirs. And so in this way, we see how much the social environment creates language use and expectations of language use. Looking then into linguistics, the study of language really has been looked at in 3 major ways. So looking at language as a structure, looking at language as mental faculty, so this is Chomsky's work, and then looking at how language is a functional resource, and this is where Halliday really comes in. We're going to focus on Chomsky in this particular video, but we're going to get more into Halliday in future videos. So Halliday's work is called Universal Grammar, or UG, and it's this argument that humans have an innate biological capacity for language. He called it the language acquisition device. And his rationale for this theory was threefold. Most children learn language rapidly and without schooling, using only limited evidence or input from the language in their environment and limited feedback from adults. And so this argument is that the basic structures of language are already in the human brain from birth, not the language itself. So children are not born with Spanish, they're not born with Mandarin Chinese, but they're born with something more basic than that and more, he argues, universal than that. They just need to make sense of how this subconscious implicit knowledge they have of language functions for their specific languages. He talks about this as sort of like, he calls it parameter setting. And it's a little bit like he compares it to if you get a cell phone and it's already got an operating system, but you still need to go in and sort of personalize it and make it your own. And so his argument is that language acquisition is a little bit like that. So I've talked a little bit about this implicit knowledge of rules. And so it's implicit, right? It's the use of language, not knowledge about language. Children are not born able to tell you what a verb is necessarily, but they're able to use it through over time, right, as they acquire language. Interestingly, too, with this implicit knowledge, errors tend to be of overgeneralizations. And there's many errors children just don't make that we might expect if language learning was purely through hypothesis testing. So whereas Chomsky argues that language is purely biological, it grows in your brain like the arm grows on a fetus in utero, most linguists adopt something, they're proponents of language as active construction. So they call it active construction of a grammar theory. So the idea is that the child has the innate ability to find patterns in the language that surrounds him and create rules to account for those patterns. And this takes into account that there's always exceptions. The schooling adds new registers, that vocabulary is often not systematic, and that there is complexity to the language acquisition process that cannot be explained purely through biology. Finally, insights from neuroscience. We can go all the way back to 1861. Paul Broca discovered that damage to the left frontal lobe would impair language functioning. And so we now refer to this part of the brain as Broca's area. And that gave us insight into which parts of the brain maybe are more responsible than others for language. More recently, work in the intersection of neuroscience and linguistics has theorized that language acquisition occurs through the building of neural networks. And these are built through statistical frequency. So the more a child has opportunities in their environment to associate a word and an object, the stronger that neural network between sound and meaning grows. And so those are some current takes on how children learn language. Thank you.